Tonight, we're taking a chance as we tap into our spiritual side. Anybody know what their spiritual side is? That's good. I am not talking about religion. I am not talking about religion. I am a Christian. That is my faith. I'm not asking you to be a Christian. If you want to be one, I can show you how. But it is not required. I have respect for all faiths. All faiths. But what I'm talking about is not faith or religion. I'm talking about spirituality. So I want to get clear on what I mean by that. It means, my definition is living your life with an open heart through love. What's the difference between religion and spirituality, or is there a difference?
Well, some say that religions, people don't want to go to hell, and spirituality, people who've been to hell already. Religion should be the structures, the prayer tables, the things that you do in the course. It should help you, it should cultivate, it should be the practices, it should be the symbols, it should be the rituals that cultivate your sense that there's more.
It's always good to start out with Oprah and Rob Bell. That's a dynamic duo. Today we're starting this new series called Spiritual But Not Religious. And in our culture, a rising number of people are feeling disconnected from organized religion. And a growing number of people are describing themselves as spiritual but not religious. And as we dig a little bit deeper, it reveals their disenchantment with organized religion, but also that they have a desire to cultivate a spiritual life. So it's not, I just want to chuck love and beauty and goodness, or I want nothing to do with God or Jesus Christ or Buddha or whoever it may be, whatever religious tradition they come from. I don't just want to throw all that out, but I find that it's not helping me in the way that maybe it once did, or maybe it never did, and I was just raised in that. And in fact, perhaps it's even become a barrier to my own spiritual life. So I have this deep inner longing to have a spiritual connection, to focus on the things that really matter in life. But I find that my experience of religion is either not helping or it's actually making it harder. Would anybody have the guts to say amen under your breath to that? Because it's not just people who are outside of church, the big secret is, who feel that way. It's also a lot of people who are sitting in church every Sunday morning. And so there are people who, they look at religion in our culture, and you don't want to paint with a broad brush, but it's just kind of hard to escape sometimes. They look at religion in our culture, and they feel like it's closed-minded, judgmental, power-hungry sometimes, authoritarian, out of touch, anti-intellectual, anti-women, anti-gay, moving us backward instead of forward, violent at times. I mean, can we add to that list? That's not a very good resume, is it? Not a very good resume. And so that's how they feel when they look at religion, but most people still want to contemplate what really matters and to live a life of meaning and purpose. So you probably don't need to hear stats because you can probably identify, if you're in one church, with what I just said. But just to let you know, you're not alone. The Pew Research Center conducted a survey. They do this frequently, actually. A couple of years ago, about 20% of Americans call themselves spiritual but not religious. That's 63 million people. It's a lot of people. So you're not alone. You're in a pretty big group, actually. About 15% of churchgoers say they're spiritual but not religious. That percentage is probably a lot higher here, my guess would be. And I think by saying that, another interesting factoid is 92% of the people who say they're spiritual but not religious believe in the existence of God. It's an astounding number, 92%. Say they believe in some kind of higher power, but they do tend to express less certainty about that belief than people who are plugged into religion. They tend to hold their views with a little more open hand. The most striking difference in the survey was between people affiliated with religion and people who were not affiliated with a religion on these three statements. Do you think organized religion is too focused on rules, too concerned with money and power, and too involved with politics. The people who were affiliated with a religion, a lot of them still had a pretty high percentage of them said those, or agreed with those statements. The people who were unaffiliated, it was a much higher percent, by 20 or 25 percentage points. People who were unaffiliated tended to agree with those statements more about organized religion. So enough of the numbers, here's what's important. Here's the takeaway. The biggest difference between people who say, yeah, I'm religious, and people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious, is not a belief in God, not a belief in prayer, not a belief in morality. They all tend to believe those things. They all want a sense of peace. Most say they feel some kind of connection and wonder with the larger universe. Many, 25%, say they believe in energy forces and supernatural experiences, both affiliated and unaffiliated. All those things they share in common. The biggest difference, perhaps the only difference, was their view of organized religion. There it is. Not the deeper spiritual stuff. The difference between the religious and the spiritual, but not religious, is their view of organized religion. When people tell me that, I just think, well, I practice disorganized religion. So it's not very organized. But that's what separates. The view of organized religion is what separates the religious from the spiritual, but not religious. And so I had a conversation with a thoughtful lady this week who said she is drawn to the teaching of Jesus. She's thought about it a long time, wasn't really raised in church, but is open to it. Was asking me questions about one church, actually. And she said, the problem I have is that in the media, or even, unfortunately, in conversations I've had with some religious people, I feel like they're just trying to convert me. And she said, I feel like religion is a well that I go to, and that I discover that it's dry. Or more appropriate to where we live, it's like a mirage in the desert. And I think there's water, and I think it's going to refresh me and feed my soul and show me goodness and beauty and mercy and love and compassion and fairness and righteousness and all the things that I long for in my life and meaning and purpose. But I get there, and it's dry. That's how I feel about religion. And you would definitely say she's a spiritual person. She's very, very open to spirituality. Now, there are skeptical people who probably think this is totally hype, especially if they're coming from the bait and switch religious world. But you're going to find out that it's true. If you've never read the Gospels, the 4 accounts of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will find, and I'm going to challenge you to read one of them in this series, and we're going to talk about one of them in this series, you will find that the central plot of Jesus' life in all 4 Gospels is this same struggle between the religious establishment of his culture and his desire for an authentic spiritual life. If you don't know that, I challenge you, I invite you to read the Gospel of John, because that's where we're going to be in this series. You could read the Gospel of John in like an hour. It's not that long, 21 chapters. You will find that this is the central theme of the Gospel of John and all 4 Gospels. Jesus is encountering the dominant religious establishment of his culture, the way that people are supposed to find God. And he's bumping up against that to the extent that he is eventually killed partially for that reason. So if you're still alive, you haven't gone as far as he has in your struggle to find an authentic spiritual life in the midst of what he viewed as a hypocritical religious system. And as a matter of fact, we have that word hypocrite because of him. The gospel is written in Greek. Matthew has Jesus using this word quite a bit to refer to the religious people he encountered. It's the Greek word hypokrites. It means play actor. It's a theater term. The people who changed their mask to be happy or sad, they were play actors, hypokrites. And he looked at many religious people and he said, you're a hypokrites, a hypocrite, a play actor. You're pretending to be something, but you're something else. So this is the central struggle of Jesus' life. So that's where we're going to be in this series. I want to quickly speed through some disclaimers that I have to give you about the Gospel of John, speaking of religion and spirituality. Before we even read the verses, we're going to look at chapter 2 and chapter 3 today. We're going to speed through them kind of quickly, see the highlights, but I need to say some things about the Gospel of John. From its earliest days, the Gospel of John is called the spiritual gospel because it was different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The dominant theory is of the four Gospels that Mark was written first. It's called Markan priority. And so you have Mark, and then Matthew and Luke borrow heavily from Mark. But Matthew and Luke also use sources that we don't have. There's a common source that they both use, but we don't have it anymore. It's lost to history. And so even though they were written decades after Jesus walked the earth, and that raises questions for people, there is some kind of oral tradition and some writing that led to the writing of the Gospels that we have now. Are you with me so far? And so you have Mark, and then Matthew and Luke borrow from Mark, and then they borrow from a common source. And then Matthew and Luke both use sources that are different that we don't have anymore. They draw on different material, but still, largely, they're similar. So they're called the Synoptic Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. It means seeing together. They're kind of alike. Gospel of John is black sheep of the family, right? If your Thanksgiving conversations are awkward around the dinner table, that's how the Gospel of John feels, around the table with the Gospels. It's just different. So from the earliest days, it was called the spiritual gospel. It's not concerned with chronological order. It's different order than the others, different sayings of Jesus, different structure. It's just different. Probably written in the 90s AD. We're talking about 70 years after Jesus walked the earth, which raises questions for people. If that's a question for you, the truth is probably somewhere between the extremes. Some people say, the Gospels are a fabrication. There's really no reason to believe that. Other people say, they're dropped out of heaven by God in their final form. Well, probably not. The truth is going to be somewhere in between of those two extremes. But one of the things in the Gospel of John, and bear with me and then the disclaimer will be over, I'm talking really fast, like the speaker at the end of drug commercials. So one of the things is that by the time the Gospel of John is written, in probably the 90s, Jesus was Jewish, all of his early followers were Jewish, Apostle Paul was Jewish. But by the 90s, the Christian religion, that thing called the Christian religion, had predominantly become a Gentile religion. And there were political reasons why Christians wanted to be identified with Jews, and the Jews were like, stay away from us, you guys. But they were both small minorities under threat of persecution in the Roman Empire. And so what we read in all the Gospels, but really in John, is this struggle between Jews and Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And what that leads to, and we're going to see it in the passage today, that John will write things like negative things about the Jews. So, again, these are two tiny minority religious sects in the Roman Empire. Pronunciation's important sometimes more than others. And they are having a family argument. We live post-Holocaust. When I went to my buddy Rabbi Shmuley's Sabbath dinner a few weeks ago, I sat next to a lady named Judy whose grandparents were killed in the Holocaust. So we know what happens when people take the Bible outside of its historical context and read their own prejudices into it, and people die. So we don't want to do that. There's no room for anti-Semitism in a Jesus-following Christianity. It's kind of ironic to be an anti-Semite and to follow a Jewish rabbi. We don't want to do that. So what's happening in John is, when he refers to the Jews, he's referring to a particular set of religious leaders who have a particular way of doing things. The author of John is probably a Jew himself. Doesn't make any sense that this is anti-Semitic. That's not the intention. So when we read the Jews, we want to read it as, okay, there's a particular small set of people who are representing the religious establishment that the early Christians were pushing up against. Does that make sense? That's a really important disclaimer, isn't it? Makes me uncomfortable as we talk about spirituality and religion, because as a pastor, I don't want to perpetuate harmful views. And I know it's super important to interpret the Bible in its historical context, and when it's not, bad things happen. So that's a struggle I have, even. So I hope you hear my heart, even, and that disclaimer. All right, so after giving that, let's read a passage in chapter 2, and we'll talk about that for a few minutes. We'll read a passage in chapter 3 and talk about that. So there are people who want to curate a Jesus-inspired spirituality in their lives, but they find that religion makes that very difficult for them. All right? So in that vein, let's read John chapter 2. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding, big wedding feast. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." This is a really embarrassing situation. They drank all the wine. The host is like, "I'm out," like party foul. You can't run out of wine at the wedding feast. The word woman, to call your mother woman, was not a sign of disrespect in this culture. It doesn't mean it the way it would mean it now. Jesus says, "Woman," or "Mom, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons, a lot of water. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink," like you do. It's just strategic, right? "But you have saved the best wine till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. I saw this picture on Facebook recently. I think I have a picture here. You see the sign says water. You see what's on the shelves? Somebody said Jesus must have passed through the water aisle. Not bad. So we have a wedding feast here in the ancient world. This is a Mediterranean culture. Wine is extremely important. And the host runs out. It's going to be really embarrassing for him. And Jesus performs his first miracle in the Gospel of John, and he saves the host embarrassment of running out of wine. Not only that, but it's the good stuff. Jesus makes the best wine, and the host looks even better because he saved the best wine until last. What John is saying here is that because Jesus used the ceremonial washing pots, remember? That's what the pots were for. They were for washing hands. It's a Jewish practice of washing hands before meals. Jesus takes that water and he turns it into wine. So John is saying that the water pots and the rituals, what they mean, is a dry ceremonial ritual compared to the joy that comes from an authentic spiritual relationship with Jesus. That's the point he's making. Once again, we live this side of the Holocaust, so we're going to be very careful. So when I was at my buddy Rabbi Shmuly's house, we washed our hands twice before the meal, and he introduced it very respectfully because I think he thought maybe we wouldn't participate. I kind of had it, but we did. Well, we need our hands washed, So the little container came around, and everybody passed it around the table, and it came to me, and you just pour it over your fingertips like this, and then just pass it to the next person. And then we got up to go get the food, and before we got the food, we washed our hands again. There was another container of water they had next to the sink, and we washed our hands again, and then filled it up for the next person, and then passed it on to the next person. And here's what I thought while I was participating in those hand washing rituals. I thought, you know what? I need clean hands. And I don't just mean for germs, but I need clean hands because I'm a person who is not perfect. No perfect people allowed here. If you're perfect, you're really going to mess us up, okay? No perfect people allowed here. And this symbolizes for me that I don't have to be perfect. I'm not, but I'm on a journey. And so every week at the Sabbath, I can stand a little hand washing to remind me that I can be humble and that God can give me a new start. And as I enjoy this fellowship, these relationships around the table, I can do so with a clean heart and clean hands and an open mind and compassion and understanding. That's what it meant to me. So there was a lot of meaning for me. But if you go through religious rituals, and maybe you grew up in a Christian or some other tradition, and there are religious rituals and things you're supposed to do, but they don't mean anything to you, what happens? They become this dry thing that's mechanical. You go through the motions. It's just kind of about doing that thing, but I don't know why we do that thing. We just do that thing because we do that thing because we're supposed to do that thing. And that's it. And if that has been your experience of religion, well, that's probably a negative. Because that thing didn't mean anything to you, but that thing also didn't help you to curate a spiritual life that's vibrant and alive and real and makes you a better person and puts you in touch with ultimate reality and draws you, beckons you to be a more loving, compassionate person. If the rituals didn't do that for you, they probably did more harm than good. And so I think the point that John is making is external religion, rituals and symbols, if we participate in them and they don't mean anything to us or they don't make us better, that can be dry, lifeless religion. But he says there's a different experience, one that does produce joy. And if you internalize spiritual truths for your life, and it's not about just doing things that may not mean anything to you, but if you can internalize meaning, maybe you can still do the rituals, but if you can internalize them, they'll draw you from the inside and make you better on the inside. And so the point he's making is, if you feel like your experience of religion has even robbed you of joy, if you have been a part of an oppressive religion that's stifling to you, and it's even been a barrier between you and God in an authentic spiritual life, John is saying to you, brothers, sisters, I got good news for you. There is something better. There is a spiritual life that really does produce joy that you don't have to fake. You don't have to fake it to make it. There is for people who've been raised in an oppressive religious environment, that's really hard to believe. For some of you, it's hard to be here this morning. I bet our live stream viewership is up today because I bet there are people who are interested, but they're just not willing to show up at a church service. If that's you, it can be really hard to kind of let go of those rituals because everything you hear reminds you of that. It's like a flashback. It's a trigger. It takes you back to those old experiences that were oppressive and hurtful and painful. For some of us here, this is the greatest source of pain in our lives. But John says, if that's you, there is a way of having an authentic spirituality in your life that really does produce joy. You may not be able to see that yet, but there really is a way. And maybe here's what that can look like. We'll go to chapter 3 now. If you've been that person who was raised in an oppressive religious environment, this will probably have special meaning for you. If you don't have much of a religious background, this can still have profound meaning for you because the challenge is still for every human being, regardless of their background. But in John chapter 3, Jesus encounters a religious leader named Nicodemus. And Nicodemus visits Jesus at night so nobody would know that he was coming there. Nicodemus had an inkling that perhaps there is something more than what I'm participating in. This particular, not all Jews, no. This particular type, this subset of religious practice that was being perpetuated by the religious leaders Jesus encountered. Nicodemus is one of those. He says, I have an inkling that maybe there's more to life than this kind of oppressive, stifling religion. And so he visits Jesus. He has a hunch that something is missing and he wants to explore that. And here's what Jesus says to him, John chapter 3. Now there was a Pharisee, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night and said, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him. Jesus replied, very truly I tell you, nobody can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. Huh? Right? It's like you almost expect the disclaimer, like Jesus is like, I'm not going to lie to you, it's going to get weird. All right? And then he launches into this statement because you're like, where did that come from? What does that mean? No, very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. Verse 4, how can somebody be born when they are old? Nicodemus asked. Obvious question. Surely, he's like, now I'm going to get weird too. Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb and be born, just like we're covering that base, right? You know, and so they're having this dialogue. And then Jesus answered, very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God, which is the empire of God, over against the Roman Empire. God's empire is different from the Roman Empire, the empires of this world. Nobody can enter the kingdom of God, the empire of God, unless they are born of water, that's natural birth, and the Spirit, born like every human being's born, but also born of the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. Talking about spirituality in this series. You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it pleases. It's kind of mysterious language, isn't it? You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. And then we'll skip ahead a few verses to the one that many people have heard before. And Jesus further explains to Nicodemus, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. So that's the field goal verse. When you're watching football today and there's a field goal and some dude's holding John 3:16 up behind the end zone. That's the field goal verse, John 3:16. So Jesus tells this religious leader, Nicodemus, that curating a life in the Spirit, an authentic spirituality, is so different from practicing a religion that it's so radically different that it's like you have to go back and be born all over again to understand what I'm saying to you. That's what Jesus tells this very religious man with a reputation, with power. He says, you've experienced a particular kind of religion and you have this sense that there's more. But to experience that, you're going to have to go back and humble yourself to the extent that it's going to get weird. It's going to feel weird. You're going to have to start saying things like, everything I know is wrong. I think all the stuff I believe, I question everything now. I'm just not sure about any of it anymore. And you're going to have to go back. You're going to have to erase the whiteboard, man, and start from scratch. That's how radically different an authentic spiritual life is from the religion that you experience and that you perpetuate. That's what Jesus says to this man. It's like you're going to have to be born all over again. Now remember, we're talking about joy, that joy is possible in chapter 2. And some of us have a hard time believing that. This can actually be comforting to those of us who are raised in an oppressive religious environment. If you were raised in fundamentalism, it can be comforting to you to realize that cultivating a spiritual life will feel like you have to be born all over again, because you're like, you know what? I probably need to do that. That's probably what I need to do. And this might actually be permission giving to you, because brain plasticity is a powerful thing. And if you've been indoctrinated a certain way, you feel guilty for even questioning it. But at the same time, if you're honest, you can't help but question it. And it might actually be strangely comforting to think, you know what? Jesus told Nicodemus, a very religious person, he's going to have to go back and start all over again. And maybe it's okay for me to just kind of put it all aside, not out of ill will, not out of anger, but just put it aside and say, you know what? I'm just going to leave everything open to question. I'm not going to be afraid to turn over every rock, no rock unturned. And I'm going to go back to the beginning and see what was really true for my life and what can really produce joy and peace and openness and love and mercy and goodness and justice and righteousness and compassion in my life. I'll just put the religion over here because Jesus said it's okay. Put all the religious messages that I've heard. So if you ask questions, Jesus cries. I'm going to put that over here. I'm just going to put it all aside. And I've got permission now to go start all over again, just like a baby. And I'm going to look at life with wide-eyed wonder. If you've held a baby recently, they just kind of look around, not sure what they're looking at, but they're taking it all in, little sponges. And I'm just going to take it all in. I'm going to be willing to humble myself, put aside what I have assumed is true, and I'm going to go back and just start from the beginning. And if you were raised in that kind of an environment, there are going to be times when you're going to read something or hear something or see something, and it's going to trigger you. And it's going to be comforting and tempting for you to go back and just pick that up again and be, not born, to jump from infancy to adulthood again, and to start assuming some things again. It's going to be really tempting to do that. But Jesus says, you know what, Nicodemus? You're going to have to be born again. And maybe that's permission giving for you to say, okay, I was triggered to pick that up, but I'm going to leave it there. Leave it there. It's going to be okay. And I'm going to go back to baby again. Spiritual me, kind of baby, childlike wonder. And just take it all in again. and figure out what I really believe in. John says, if you're willing to do that, there is a kind of authentic spirituality that really can produce joy. Now, just quickly, because this is important. John 3:16 there says, if you believe in me, you'll have eternal life. This is the pile that many religious people have to leave sitting over here so that they can humble themselves and go back to the beginning. The pile is often based on this verse, whether they realize it or not, in that word believe. There were a lot of people raised in religious environments where the definition of Christianity was, got a list for you, got a bullet point list. We would call it a creed. And what I need you to do is believe this bullet point list of statements. And if you believe them, then you're a Christian. People who don't believe them are not Christians. People who do believe them are Christians. So you sign at the bottom, right? And that's the definition of religion or spirituality that a lot of people have been given. Let's go further. If you were raised in the kind of environment I was raised in, and many of you were, they would have read the born again passage. You must be born again. And then they would give you the list. And to be born again to them meant, so they would say, Jesus talked to a really religious guy who believed a bunch of stuff, but you don't want to be like him. You want to be born again. Now, believe all this stuff. And so there was a lady, a friend of mine, named Joy, actually, interestingly enough, who said, I had to be born again from being born again. That I went through this, and this language was used, but what it really was a list of stuff that I was supposed to believe. And when I stopped believing that, I went through this incredibly emotionally painful crisis. They're like, I don't have the same friends I used to have when I went through this thing with this list. And what we need to know is the word believe, anytime it's used in John, most of the time in the New Testament, has absolutely nothing to do. The theological word would be jack squat. It has jack squat to do with believing a list of things. The word believe there, you could just substitute the word trust. It's not believing a bullet point list of statements. It's relational trust in a person. Jesus, again, we're in the context of this conversation between Jesus and a very religious man. Jesus is saying to him, we're like on the porch at night here, okay? And Jesus is saying to him, Nicodemus, you have put your trust in the list, and you know that's not working for you. So trust me here, and I'm going to show you how it can be real. That's it. That's what it means. And that's gotten blown up into this thing, believe, you got to believe. And so it's a relational term that means trust. Imagine if a wife was thinking about maybe making a career change. And she's been thinking about it for a while. She's kind of felt this draw, but she's like, no, I can't do this. And after fighting it, maybe for a few years, she's like, you know what, I need to do this. I feel like I'm compelled to do this. I want to make this career change. And she tells her spouse, I want to make this change. Do you support me? And he's like, yeah, sure. And kind of him-haw. And then she's like, no, this is really hard for me. I've mustered up all the courage I can. I want to make this career change. I need you to believe in me. I need you to support me and to come alongside me and believe that I can do this. I need you to believe in me. And so I can do that. And he goes back to his man cave, and he types out a list of statements, true statements, about his wife. You have blonde hair. You are 5 feet, 5 inches tall. You like cereal for breakfast. You complain about my loud snoring, right? And he makes a list of propositional truth statements about his wife, and he takes her the list. And he says, honey, I believe in you. And she reads the list, and she calls a counselor. And then she says, honey, when I said I needed you to believe in me, I didn't need a list of propositional statements that you give intellectual assent to. I need you to support me and believe that I can do this and trust me. That's the difference between believe in a propositional creed And what Jesus is saying to Nicodemus, if you trust me, I can lead you to what really does produce joy and goodness and mercy and all the things that you're searching for and that you know you don't have. That kind of authentic spirituality really is possible. Some of us are in a place in life where maybe that's a step we're willing to take. Some of us, if we're going to be honest, we're not sure. We're not sure. The triggers are too powerful. And we're tempted to say, you know what, I don't know. I don't know if I can do this. I think for some of us, starting all over again, like being born again, is kind of like a wounded soldier coming back from a war whose legs have been amputated. And he has to learn to walk all over again. If that's you, I have a video I want to show you, 2-3 minutes long. And it's of these wounded soldiers going through their journey of learning to walk again, and there are tears. And there are pitfalls, and there are disappointments. There are times they stand, they think it's going to work, and they fall down. You know, we'd say we get pulled back into this pile again. But over time, they just keep going, and they get glimpses of victory. Oh, it could be better. And then eventually, something amazing happens. Maybe this is a picture of your spiritual life. Let's watch. Can you imagine? Can you put yourself in their shoes for a moment? And for some of us, maybe that really is a picture of our spiritual lives. And by learning to walk again, it doesn't mean that we're going to go back to that pile. That pile's going to be gone. It's going to look different. An authentic spiritual life that produces joy for you is going to look different than that pile. And you're going to have to be okay with that. And there are people who won't like that. But maybe that is a picture of your spiritual life. Just a couple more things before we close. Richard Rohr is a spiritual director that has been influential on me and on Aaron, and this is a book that I'm going to recommend to you if you're willing to read along the gospel or read through the Gospel of John in this series. Here's another resource that would be great. It's a book called Everything Belongs by Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R. Everything Belongs by Richard Rohr, and reading this book might be helpful to you if you're going through this journey. But here's one of the things he says in the book. This comes from a chapter entitled "Don't Push the River." Isn't that great? The final stage of the wisdom of faith is what we might call becoming the holy fool. Ironically, the holy fool is one who knows he doesn't know, but doesn't need to know either. Paradoxically, that's the liberating kind of knowing we're talking about. The holy fool doesn't need to know. He obviously would like to know, or she obviously would like to know, but she is able to leave full knowing to God. This isn't anti-intellectualism and pretending to be, being ignorant of things that we can know. But this is about saying, you know what, there's a lot I don't understand in this life. And a lot I don't understand about religion and spirituality, so I'm willing to have open hands. And maybe learning to walk, being born again, looks like having those open hands and being willing to be the holy fool, because then that takes trust. That's the kind of trust Jesus was talking about. And in my own personal life, to wrap it up here, kind of where I am, I've heard people talk about what they believe my entire life, and I've been called all kinds of names. The first 6 months of starting this church, I was called more names than in junior high and high school combined by religious people who did not like what this church is about. And so I've grown weary of hearing what people believe or of asking me what I believe. So one of the things that's most important to me, and it actually means something to me, is when I see people who talk the language of spirituality, who are willing to do something and give something to make somebody else's life better. And if you remember this past Christmas Eve, we said every year we give 100% of the Christmas Eve offering away, but this year it's different. We challenged everybody in the church to give an equal amount they spent on Christmas gifts, which is crazy. Most people aren't going to do that. And we didn't know what's going to happen. I knew there'd be people who would respond, people who wouldn't, but we've tabulated it all now, and every penny of this is going to be given away. It's going to be split 50-50 between Chandler Christian Community Center here locally, that blesses kids in need, and then Food for the Hungry Nicaragua in San Bartolo, Nicaragua, the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And so the total amount that you gave to the Christmas Eve offering, and this is a congregation of about 125 people. It's pretty darn good for 125 people. You ready? $7,877. And isn't that great? And we're going to split that now 50-50 for kids in need here and kids in need in Nicaragua. For me, that's a part of what I need to see. and an authentic spirituality. Not just people talking about what they believe, but people doing things that cost them. That's the kind of life I feel called to, and that's the kind of thing that inspires me as well. So for some, you may not even find reading passages out of the Bible helpful. That may not be where you are. It may be hard for you to go to a church service. It may be hard for you to watch on the live stream. Others, you're open and you're searching, but you've been turned off by a lot of religion. I want to invite you over the next few weeks as we continue this series to keep plugging in, to watch on the live stream or watch YouTube, send the clip to somebody else and keep showing up. We're going to talk about how to cultivate an authentic spirituality in your life. We have a guest speaker coming in February named Teresa Blythe, who's a spiritual director, and she's going to lead an interactive discussion with us about discerning your own kind of spiritual path. All right, regardless of where you find an authentic spirituality, whether it's in the Jesus tradition, it's somewhere else. I want to invite you to have the courage to take Jesus up on his offer and to start all over again and believe in faith that joy is possible. There is a spirituality that can lead to joy.